Hi everyone, this is an overview of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. And Locke is an empiricist, which means that he believes that knowledge comes from experience. And in this essay, in these two books that we'll be looking at today, he's going to critique the rationalists. And a rationalist is someone who believes that knowledge comes from reason. And as it says here at the beginning, neither principles nor ideas are innate. So the rationalist, he's addressing the rationalist here. He's saying that the rationalist has the wrong idea about ideas, about knowledge. It doesn't come from within, it doesn't come through reason, it comes from experience. So he's critiquing René Descartes, he's also critiquing Plato, he's probably also critiquing John Calvin, the theologian. So later on, as we'll see in Book 2, in Chapter 9, he's going to turn his attention to critique Descartes' account of innate knowledge. And if you recall, Descartes believes that to be or to exist is to think. He thinks that's wrong, so let's go ahead and see what he has to say. Jumping in to Book 1, Chapter 1. Now this website actually only gives us excerpts from Books 1 and 2, and I'm only giving you highlights from both of them, so this will be fairly quick. He starts off and he says, "It is an established opinion amongst some men that there are in the understanding certain innate principles." And so there you have it, the contrary position that he sets up. He's going to attack the rationalist point of view. He says, moving on to Chapter 2 in Book 1, it's taken for granted that there are certain principles, both speculative and practical, for they speak of both, universally agreed upon by all mankind. He continues, which they bring into the world with them as necessarily and really as they do any of their inherent faculties. So just as we bring in faculties, when we're born with faculties, right? Well, the rationalists think, those who believe in innate knowledge, think that we also bring knowledge with us into the world as well, which is discoverable by reason. He thinks that it's taken for granted that this is universally agreed upon, that there are these certain principles that everybody in the world agrees upon, and he's going to say that's not the case. But first, what are some of those examples? What are examples of these principles? He says, he gives us one or two examples here, quote, "Whatsoever is, end quote." And the second, quote, "It is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be," end quote. So these are, this is basically the law of non-contradiction. So a basic principle that we need in philosophy to make sense of language, of reason. He says that these are the examples that are usually cited as examples for what knowledge we bring into the world. But he says, quote, "There are a great part of mankind to whom they are not so much as known." And there's the ellipses here that continues. He describes his best example is of children. Children come into the world. They don't seem to have any knowledge of the law of non-contradiction or any other principle. And so there's no universal agreement. And because there's no universal agreement, there must not be this innate knowledge. Okay, so now we've skipped over a lot in Book 1 and have arrived at Book 2, where he's going to talk about the origin of ideas. He asks how we come by them. How do we come by our ideas? How do we come by knowledge if it's not through reason or if it's not innate within us? So he's going to say it's going to be by experience. How is the mind furnished? How do we come by knowledge? He says it's in one word, from experience. And by this, he means two things. It's either through sensation or by reflection. So by sensation, he means that the senses deliver to us, to our mind, information, and that turns into knowledge. So that's sensation. It's a big part of how we understand, maybe the majority, he thinks, of our knowledge comes from sensation or our senses. And then it's also reflection, which he defines as the perception of the operations of our own mind within us. In other words, our mind thinking about its own self operating. That's a source of knowledge as well. He says, external objects furnish the mind with the ideas of sensible qualities, which are all those different perceptions they produce in us. The mind furnishes the understanding with ideas of its own operations. So we get our knowledge from the external world, and we get our knowledge from the mind, but the mind reflecting on itself. So those two sources. And now he turns back to the example of children. He says, think about children. Think about the state of a child coming into the world. He says, we have little reason to think him stored with plenty of ideas that are to be matter of his future knowledge. It is by degrees he comes to be furnished with them. So in other words, a baby doesn't come into the world with all this knowledge built in. The child learns by experience and acquires knowledge from the environment. And this is done by having one's attention on the world and on one's environment. So focusing attentively on different objects that they encounter through experience. Through this, the child or the person builds knowledge. And he says in chapter 8, and hence we see the reason why it is pretty late before most children get ideas of operations of their own mind. Children, he continues, when they come first into it, are surrounded with a world of new things, which by a constant solicitation of their senses draw the mind constantly to them. So children are very distracted. They're focused on the external world, on their senses, and so they don't spend very much time reflecting on their own mind's operations. So that's why they are very limited. That's why it takes so much time for a child to be educated and to acquire full knowledge. Now, chapter 9, he's turning back to René Descartes to critique him in particular. He says, I know it is an opinion, and this is René Descartes' opinion, that the soul always thinks, and that it has the actual perception of ideas in itself constantly as long as it exists, and that actual thinking is as inseparable from the soul as actual extension is from the body, end quote. So here he's going to argue against this in the following chapters, and I'm just going to quickly give you a summary of some of these arguments. Chapter 10, the soul thinks not always, for this wants proof. In other words, there's no proof, there's no evidence that the soul is always thinking. He says, is the soul always thinking? His experience doesn't tell us this. Your experience doesn't tell us that your soul is always thinking. A soul, he thinks, does think, but it just sometimes thinks. So there's no evidence that the rationalist is right or René Descartes is right, that the soul is always for the soul to exist, it is always thinking. Let's get down to chapters 11 and 12. He argues that if it thinks when he is unconscious of it or when he is sleeping, it is a different person. So he says here, it being hard to conceive that anything should think and not be conscious of it. He continues, or if it be possible that the soul can, whilst the body is sleeping, have its thinking, enjoyments, and concerns, its pleasures or pains, a part which the man is not conscious of nor partakes in, it is certain that Socrates asleep and Socrates awake is not the same person. So if there is thinking going on in the soul that you are not aware of, then when your soul is thinking those other thoughts, it's not you. That's his point of view. And in fact, John Locke has an interesting theory that he builds later in the essay on personal identity. Skipping down to chapter 13, the next argument. So he says, if the soul thinks when it is sleeping, there's no way to know it. Very simple. And that's basically 13 and 14, the point he's making there. It would be impossible to know if, in fact, it is thinking when you're unconscious. Chapter 15. So he says in chapter 15, if the soul thinks when he sleeps, it is useless. And that seems absurd based on his assumption that we are made by a, quote, infinitely wise creator. He says, why should he make so admirable a faculty as the power of thinking, that faculty which comes nearest the excellency of his own incomprehensible being, to be so idly and uselessly employed at least a fourth part of its time here, as to think constantly without remembering any of those thoughts, without doing any good to itself or others, or being any way useful to any other part of the creation, end quote. So in other words, it seems like it would be pretty useless if we were not aware of what was going on in our minds. And so that's a reason to reject that that we are actually unaware of these times when the soul is thinking and we're not aware of it. Chapter 16, he says, if the soul thinks, we'd expect it to be rational thought going on or rational knowledge, but our dream states are, as he says here, extravagant and incoherent, and he goes on to say frivolous and irrational. So that's a reason to think that whatever else goes on in a sleep state unconsciously is not any more rational than what goes on in waking state. Skipping down a bit, chapter 18, he says that it seems like it's just a confused notion that the soul always thinks. It seems that the person who employs this idea is just doing it to, he says here, serve a hypothesis without any evidence. So it's just sort of a dogma that's held without evidence, without proof. Going down, finally, chapter 19, he says, for it is altogether as intelligible to say that a body is extended without parts as that anything thinks without being conscious of it or perceiving that it does so. It just seems to him that for thinking to be going on, there must be conscious awareness of it going on. And so it makes no sense to say the opposite, that thinking does go on without being aware of it. Okay, so in chapter 20, he just wraps it up. He wraps it up in these final chapters saying, I see no reason, therefore, to believe that the soul thinks before the senses have furnished it with ideas to think on. And he says a few more things down below, but I'm just going to stop there and hope that that was helpful for you.